When you receive digital collections, you typically receive them as a series of files and folders. But how do you know which files go with which folders? Now, before I said a file name is just a label so that the file system knows where to identify a sequence of bytes. It knows where to find it and what we call that. Modern computer systems have very few rules for what file names can be. Nowadays, they can be extremely long, contain nearly any Unicode character, have as many dots in them as you want. It's all your choice. I have an example here of FAT32, which, as I pointed out before, had some what seemed like very weird conventions about like the length of file names and stuff like that. But nowadays, you can do almost whatever you want, and that's kind of where the trouble comes in. You're given whatever freedom you want, and so then the question is okay, how are you going to use that freedom? File naming. The purpose of a file name is for humans to communicate the contents of a file without requiring you to open up the file itself. And that's pretty easy when we're creating files for our own personal use, but starts feeling harder when you're creating files for shared environments. You may have an impulse to create a perfect file name that includes all of the necessary information for anyone at your organization to understand the file. But, well, there is no perfect file name. There's no universal best practice for this. However, there are some good ideas to keep in mind when you do have the ability to create file names. So for example, limit the kind of characters that you are using in file names. Things like just lowercase Latin letters, or avoiding the use of spaces, or avoiding the usage of other characters like hashes or at signs or other things that might be interpreted by a computer to be something else. Define a smaller character set, and you're limiting the potential for some sort of strange character causing a problem as you're transferring files between systems. You're probably going to have a couple of standard elements within your file name, so use a specific character to separate those elements and keep it dedicated to that task. So something like an underscore or dash doesn't matter. As long as you're being consistent about it, it makes it easier for scripts to extract information from file names. It makes it easier for you to parse it visually. It just helps with organization. Next, if you're putting something like a date inside of your file name, use the ISO 8601 standard. It's the year, month, date, YYYMMDD. It's nice because your files automatically sort by date much cleaner if you're using the file name to sort them. Also, there's less confusion between people that do day than month or month than day, because if you put year first, then it's pretty clear the next thing is going to be the month. Similarly, whatever you do in terms of putting those elements in your file names, try to go from an order, generally least specific to most specific, so that, again, when you're sorting files, it helps you narrow down things and group things automatically by that principle. So those rules will help you build the foundations of more complex packages. The next level of organization would be foldering. And your choices here really depend on the materials you're working with. The only major consideration I would think about is how deep do you want your foldering to go. Every layer of folders that you create can help provide more organization, but can also make it more difficult to work with the packages. And as always, the correct answer depends on your use case. So the extremes are, of course, not useful. Having no folders is not useful. Having too many folders is not useful. But I can't say definitely, just go 3 folders deep or just go 5 folders deep. Instead, I'll show you an example of what MYPL uses for its media packaging specifications. So you can see here that the top level here is a hard drive, and then we have a folder that groups all of the media that of one kind. So all of the videos that got digitized, all those folders are going to be in this video folder. Then underneath that, you have a bag. You'll see a folder called primary ID, and inside that folder is a bunch of bag-looking things like data and baget.txt and manifest MD5.txt, etc. So that is how we tell our vendors to package fix the information. We don't want it any other way. This is the only thing that we'll accept. It means we only need to think about one way to validate fix the information. So that's fantastic for us. But within that data folder, we then divide things up with a couple more folders. So we have very fixed names for these things, the preservation files, the service copies. We have an images folder if that can be created. We have a edit folder if those are files that we want. But they generally group files by the role that they will serve long term in our processes. And then within that folder, what you'll see are the media files stored alongside a metadata sidecar. And you can note the relationship between those things because they have the exact same file, except the extension is a little bit different. So you have file name.mkv, so that's the media file, and then file name.json. Well, JSON is a structured data format. That is where we're storing a lot of metadata. But then you also have file name.mkv.qctools.xml.gz. Well, that's an extension associated to a quality control program that helps us check the technical characteristics of the images within that media file. And because all of our digitization vendors are required to package files like this, we know exactly what to expect when we receive a hard drive, regardless of who sends it to us. And that allows us to just get right to the task of making sure that the files look right, rather than trying to sort out what in the world's going on that hard drive. However, two caveats to this schema. Number one is we don't get to choose the names of the files that we acquire. Not in all cases. So sometimes we acquire somebody's archives, and when we do that, um, it they chose a name that they wanted to choose. And that name embeds some metadata from the original author, and changing that name means that we are destroying that data. So it doesn't really behoove our job to try and figure out what the file is by changing the file name. It makes no sense. Even if they use characters that we don't like, it's too bad. Those characters might mean something, let's keep them around. Or we might collect a complex digital object like a website or born digital video package. And those things have very specific file names that depend on one another. They depend on those file names staying stable because it's how they link to each other. And if you were to change one of those names, very well that the object might stop functioning. You might not be able to work with it the way that it was supposed to be worked with. So again, we just leave those alone. You may notice that the background rule here is um, you should have rules for files and folders that you receive, but don't spend time changing file names and changing folder names to meet those roles if you don't have to. It's really, really tedious work. So whenever possible, you want to put that work on somebody else who can put it into their system and let computers do what they do. You shouldn't spend your time trying to implement these things, both for preservation purposes, but also for labor saving purposes. The second thing is, as your files move in between systems, especially as they move into systems for long-term storage, the purpose of those file names change. The folders are destroyed. The files are no longer really accessed by a human on a file system. The files are now being managed by a DAM or a repository system which has very, very different problems that it's trying to deal with. Particularly, it's managing millions of files. And so it may rename the file in order to make it easier to work with as it's managing so many files. And that makes perfect sense. It will do the smart thing. It will take the original file name, it will save that into a database record somewhere and say, like, this is what it was called when you gave it to me. But nowadays I call it something else, something that makes much more sense to me and makes it so that I am a much more reliable service. So file names are not sacrosanct. They are things that serve a purpose, and as the purpose needs to change, so does the file name change.